to you the author of Dark Tides.
Dark Tide, for me, as I said, has been quite an experience. The book came out 6 years ago, right around now, late August, early September of 2003. The paperback came out in 2004. I was thrilled to see a lot of early adopters here tonight, a lot of hardcovers that I signed before the presentation, so that was nice to see. It's been incredible for me in terms of the response. Probably not so surprising in the Boston area, the greater Boston area in New England. Been a lot of positive response there, but had a lot of response nationally as well. We were named a AP Roundup book in 2004 that kind of helped us, propelled us across the country. Got reviewed in the Chicago newspapers, Denver, San Francisco. So we kind of had a nice little run there that helped us out. I get emails from all over the country constantly. It amazes me that people who know this story or have heard of this story or are fascinated by this story, or you name it. Lots of that kind of response. Locally, kind of interesting, I did an appearance in Milton, Massachusetts, not too long ago, and there was in the newspaper article that promoted the appearance what I thought was a very appropriate typographical error promoting my appearance. It said, the appearing will be Stephen Julio, author of Dark Tide, the Greater Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. Not the greater. Great. Kind of expanded that flood out into suburbs. But I thought to me that's such an appropriate typo because every place I go in Greater Boston, I run into people who say, my great uncle was a firefighter who responded to that scene. My grandmother lived in the North End and told me about this flood since I grew up. My great-grandfather told me you could smell molasses on a hot day for years and years and years afterwards. My very first appearance on Dark Tide was in Falmouth down the Cape, and somebody came out to me and said that their grandfather had perished in the flood, and he had never really known how that had happened, and so he was kind of thrilled to find out. And so, it really sort of struck this chord locally, and I've run into that time and time again. So I love that Greater Boston Molasses Flood. It really is kind of a Greater Boston type of story. Nationally, I thought I would share with you kind of the more unusual, most unusual, I guess, reach of the flood and of Boston. I appeared on a radio station in Fargo, North Dakota, KFGO, which is the voice of downtown Fargo, if you ever get out there. And the afternoon host asked if I'd come on. He said his listeners, he thought, would be incredibly interested in the story. He's always been interested in the story. Could I come on and do a 3 or 4 minute piece in the afternoon, answer some questions about the flood, about the book, etc.? I said, sure. So we go on the air. It goes very well. At the end of the interview, he takes me off the air, asks me a couple of other questions about the book, and then he said, I have one other question to ask you, you being from Boston and all. And I said, what's that? And he said, what's up with that big dig thing anyway? I said to my wife after the interview, I said, at least the big dig and the molasses flood have reached Fargo. I don't know how much else Boston news has, but that definitely has. So many of you have read the book. Can I just get a show of hands of those who have read it? Always helps me kind of gauge things. Good. Excellent. Looks like about half or so. Thank you for that. Those of you who have read it, you know that Dark Tide is really written on 2 levels. There is what I call the saga of the flood story itself. And I use that term saga quite deliberately. This is a 10-year story. It starts in the fall of 1915 with the construction of this huge steel tank on Boston's Commercial Street waterfront in the North End. And it ends in 1925 when the judge in the case, Hugh W. Ogden, rules against U.S. Industrial Alcohol, the company that owns the tank. So I gave away that little mystery for those of you who haven't read it, but it's still a great story, but that is the ending. So it's a 10-year story. In that kind of 10-year saga is everything I think we associate with a drama or narrative. There's the fact that the tank was rushed to completion. The fact that the tank was overseen by somebody who didn't really know what he was doing. The fact that it leaked from day one. The collapse itself. The massive cleanup. a court case, a huge court case in Massachusetts history, one of the largest class action suits to this day. There's a tragedy involved, 21 people killed, 150 people injured, enormous property damage in the North End. So kind of all that stuff we'd associate with storytelling or a narrative is one level that the book is written on. The other level, sort of the higher level, or the step back level as I call it, is really that big picture history that goes along with the story. And when I did the research for this book, I was really quite amazed to discover, as I was doing the research, that almost every single major issue that America was dealing with during this early part of the 20th century quite literally touches the flood story in some way. Now, there's lots of, you guys read books, there's lots of nonfiction books where, an author will set the stage and let you know what's happening around the event for the time period, so it sets the period. And that's fine, there's wonderful books like that. This book and this story, all those major issues touch the flood story. And so let me share just a couple of those with you. There is the World War I and munitions issue. Most of the molasses that's stored in this tank on the Boston waterfront, about 90% of it, in fact, is distilled into industrial alcohol and later processed one more time and used in the production of munitions during the First World War. Nitroglycerin, TNT, high explosives during the war. U.S. Industrial Alcohol, private company, by the way, with the U.S. in the name. U.S. Industrial Alcohol has as its clients the British government and the French government, the so-called friendly government, in 1916, end of 1915, 1916 really. And after the U.S. gets into the war, in 1917, the United States government becomes a big client of U.S. Industrial Alcohol. Some of the big munitions producers here in the United States, like DuPont and Hercules powder and Etna explosives, become customers of U.S. Industrial Alcohol. Molasses is a regulated war industry, very, very important to the war effort. And so World War I and munitions production plays a big part in this story, and kind of that thread weaves through Dark Tide. Number two is the anarchist movement. Anarchist movement, very violent and very active in the United States during this period of time in the early 20th century. Of all nationalities, but really the Italian anarchist movement, the de facto headquarters of the Italian anarchist movement, is really Boston's North End. These are kind of comrades of Sappho and Vanzetti who are mentioned in the book. And so why is that important? They are very, very, as I say, violent during this time period. They blow up the police station in the North End in 1915. They blow up munitions plants around the country during this period. In April of 1919, just a few months after the flood, they send package bombs through the mail to high-ranking government and business officials. And in June of 1919, just 5 months after the flood, anarchists explode 7 bombs simultaneously in cities across the United States, including at the Attorney General of the United States home, Mitchell Palmer, responsible for the famous Palmer raids. Pretty nasty stuff. And so why does that touch this flood story? Because U.S. Industrial Alcohol makes, as the cornerstone of its defense in the court case that follows, that an anarchist blew up the tank on January 15, 1919, and therefore USIA should be absolved of all liability. And so that anarchist defense, very, very strong kind of circumstantial defense, put on by the company. And as Charles Choate, the attorney for the company, later goes on to form Choate, Hall, and Stewart, by the way, those of you who may know that law firm now downtown. As he's beginning his opening in 1920, September of 1920, anarchists explode a bomb in New York City, right in Manhattan, right in front of J.P. Morgan's headquarters at lunchtime, and kill 42 people. So almost a circumstantially fortuitous, I think, event happening in New York at about the time Choate is opening his defense. And so that anarchist theme weaves its way through Dark Tide for most of the book. The third big issue is immigration. Immigration, very big issue, very controversial issue in the United States during this period as it is today. And there's lots of talk about restrictions, lots of talk about citizenship and that sort of thing. Most of the North End during this period in 1919, about 97% of the population of the North End is Italian, of Italian heritage. Most of the Irish have moved out by this time. Most of the Jewish population has moved out by this time. There are small pockets of each. Most are Italians, and about 60% still in 1919 have yet to become citizens. And so they have very, very little to say about what goes on in their own neighborhood. So when this tank is built, and this is an enormous tank, 50 feet high, 90 feet in diameter, it's able to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. And when it's plunked down in this neighborhood, one of the most congested neighborhoods, not just in Boston or the U.S., but in the entire world, one historian said the North End was as densely populated as Calcutta at this period. About 40,000 people a square mile or so in the North End. When this tank is plunked down there, there's barely a whimper from the neighborhood, and there's barely a whimper from kind of the Boston hierarchy in political structure. And it's also plunked down on the Commercial Street waterfront, one of the busiest waterfronts in the entire East Coast. Most of Boston's shipping to Europe and up and down the East Coast departs from this area. There's deliveries all day long in this area. There are train tracks, an overhead train trestle that carries passenger trains from South Station to North Station, travel every 7 minutes. Those tracks run above Commercial Street. Some people wish we still had that today because there's not really a good way to get from South Station to North Station, but it did exist then. And there is freight traffic that runs along Commercial Street. So an incredibly busy, congested area. There's the North End paving yard, which is like a DPW yard, where there is a blacksmith shop and a carpentry shop and stables with about 20 or 25 horses, and a firehouse. That's the cover of Dark Tide, by the way. The firehouse, after it gets knocked off its foundation by the molasses wave. That whole North End paving yard is about 100 feet from the tank. So a ton of congestion in this area, yet barely a whimper from any of the Boston sort of political folks, and again, from the neighborhood. The Italians in the neighborhood who pretty much kept their head down, went about their business for the most part, kind of knew something was wrong with this tank because it leaked so early, but really didn't have a lot of power to do anything about it. This tank is built 3 feet from Commercial Street. When I say, in a congested area, I mean it's literally 3 feet from the end of that tank, the sidewall of that tank, to this busy Commercial Street area. And by the way, when I say 2.3 million gallons of molasses, had a really hard time getting my arms around what that meant. I mean, I now, after the research of this book, know more about molasses than I probably ever need to know. But when I first started the research, I was just familiar with those grandma's molasses jars. That's about it. I thought that the 2.3 million gallons, how do you describe that? Well, Damon Hall, who's the lawyer for the plaintiffs in this case, says that 2.3 million gallons of molasses, the weight of that, is equivalent to about 13,000 Ford automobiles of the day. So take your Model T Ford in 1919, 13,000 of them. That's the weight that's encapsulated in this steel-plated tank that's held together with thousands of rivets. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about in the midst of this neighborhood. And as I said, these immigrants had very little to say about what happened in their neighborhood. It seems shocking for us today, where if you try to get a variance for a little playhouse, packed. The Board of Appeals is packed, with an outraged citizen. So pretty amazing kind of time. Anyway, so that immigration theme sort of weaves its way through Dark Tide for most of the book. And the fourth big one, I told you about World War I and anarchists and immigration. The fourth big one, in some ways maybe the most important one that I was fascinated with, is this. When Hugh W. Ogden makes his decision in 1925 against the company, it is a very prosperous time in America in the mid-20s. This is kind of a bustling time. Most of the smokestack industries are doing quite well, like rubber and chemical and industrial alcohol, doing pretty well. Consumers are starting to buy things for their homes like irons and toasters, things of that nature in bigger quantities. The auto industry is underway. The first auto ads appear in newspapers in 1922. So it's a fledgling auto industry, but it is begun. And capitalists are lending money. There's money to be had. There is investment. There's business expansion. J.P. Morgan and others like him are lending money. It's a pretty prosperous time. And at the same time, I think that Americans are trying to find that balance. How do we continue that good economy? How do we continue that prosperity? And at the same time, put certain restrictions on big business and certain safeguards on big business in terms of employees and safeguards around the community, that sort of thing. And there's that balance that's going on. And if you draw a line in 1925 when Ogden makes his decision, it's really the first major court decision that goes against a large industrial corporation during this period. You draw a line right there into the late 20s, after the stock market crash of 29, and certainly in the early Roosevelt years. There it is. The whole relationship between government and business changes. There are more regulations and more restrictions that are put on business by government. No question about it. I think this is a landmark case for that reason, that relationship changes. Now, people will say that in the decades that have intervened, pendulum goes one way too far, or the other way too far, and not far enough. Certainly good arguments, I think, but that whole notion of government sort of having a say over what happens with businesses in terms of regulations and permitting and things of that nature, really, I think, gets its start with Hugh W. Ogden's decision against USIA. So I consider it a very, very important case. And so what I try to do in this book, and I hope successfully, is to blend those two levels together. That saga of the flood story down here, the big picture up here. I try to weave those together and let that narrative pull the big history through, pull the history along. I've had people tell me that the history goes down easy in this book. And I take that as very much as a compliment. That was kind of my intent from the beginning. I don't think history needs to be dry and dusty. I think it's mostly history is great stories. And as long as they're sourced well, I think you can really put a book together that gives you both of those levels. And that's what I tried to do here. And what I tried to do, the way I tried to tell this story, was through the eyes of real-life characters. Some of whom you've heard before. Woodrow Wilson's a character in this book. Sakuma Benzetti's a character in this book. But most of the characters in Dark Tide you have not heard of before, and you probably would not hear of again. They are characters like firefighter George Leahy, who lives in East Boston, takes the ferry across, and works at that North End firehouse. And when the flood tank gives way during the molasses flood, he's playing cards with a few of his buddies at lunchtime in the firehouse. And when the wave hits the firehouse, it knocks it off its foundation, and the second floor pancakes down into the first. And George Leahy and several of his firefighters are trapped in an 18-inch crawl space under the firehouse. He's under there for 4 hours. He tries desperately to keep his head above the molasses. And finally, he can't do it anymore. He succumbs and he drowns in molasses. He's asphyxiated in molasses. And so we learn about George Leahy's life while he's under there, that he's a new father, he's got 3 children, etc. And so you learn a little bit about George Leahy. He tells you a little bit of that story while he's under the firehouse. John Barry, who is a stonecutter for the city of Boston, works at that same North End paving yard. He's over at the firehouse at lunchtime with his buddies, same firehouse that Leahy is, and he's trapped under that same firehouse in that same 18-inch crawl space. And he's under there for that same 4 hours, and 3 times during his ordeal, a rescue worker is able to crawl to him through a little channel and inject his spine with morphine because he's in so much pain. And when they pull him out, he does live, he does survive. They pull him out after 4 hours, and they take him to the nearby Haymarket Relief Station Hospital. And his grown daughters testify in court later that they weren't able to recognize their father when they saw him in the hospital, because when he had left for work in the morning, his hair was brown, and when they saw him in the hospital that afternoon, it had turned to snowy white from his ordeal. So John Barry never does cut stone again. He has severe back and pelvic injuries, and so his story is an important story in dark time. There are 2 children killed in the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, both of them 10 years old, both of them the children of Italian immigrants, Maria D'Stasio, Pasquale Iantosca. And they are home from school, which is the custom of the day during this time, and they are collecting firewood on the tank property. Now, normally what they would do is they would use their pails to scoop up molasses that had leaked from the very top of the tank. But today they were ending up collecting firewood when the tank gave way. Maria's body was found that afternoon. She was pulled from the molasses by firefighters who had to lay ladders across the molasses to crawl out and pull some of the victims out. Pasquale's body is not found for a week afterwards, and his father is trudging up and down the waterfront trying to find some evidence of what happened to his son. And we finally find him about a week later. He had been smashed by a freight car that had gotten caught up in this molasses lake. They were able to identify Pasquale really only because he was wearing 2 sweaters at the time. His mother had dressed him in 2 sweaters. And so we learn about the Iantoscas and the D'Stasios in this story. So the victims have a voice here, and the victims do tell a little bit about who they are and what this story is like. And there are other key characters that aren't victims that I think I should just touch upon because I think they're very important to know. There is a villain in this story. His name is Arthur Gell. He is the assistant treasurer of U.S. Industrial Alcohol, and he is charged with the responsibility of building this tank, overseeing construction of this tank. The only problem is he's a great financial person, but he has no technical experience or expertise, no architectural experience or expertise, no engineering experience or expertise. He can't read plans, he can't read blueprints, doesn't know anything about a factor of safety, and doesn't consult anyone on that. So, as I said to my wife, other than that, he was perfectly qualified to oversee this project. He's put in charge of this project, and in the fall of 1915, when the steel plates are delivered, nobody inspects those steel plates. They are found later to be much thinner than the specs call for. The tank is constructed very, very fast. Crews are working 24 hours a day. Lots of talk about how the tank, these are overlapping, sort of they call it lap joint construction, overlapping steel plates held together with rivets. Lots of stories about how the plates were not plumb for those rivets and that the tank was shoddily put together. And it also comes out in court later. Gell was supposed to test this tank upon its completion by filling this 50-foot tank with water when it was completed to at least see if it held in terms of leaks, not weight, but leaks. And he testifies in court afterwards that he had neither the time nor the money to do that. And so instead of filling the tank, 50-foot tank with water, he fills the tank with 6 inches of water. 50-foot tank with 6 inches of water. Takes it up past the first angle joint and declares it ready for use. And so Arthur P. Gell is really the villain of this book, I think legitimately so. When he gets reports of the tank leaking from day one, and when I say leaking, I don't just mean pinprick leaks. I mean long 50-foot streams of molasses coming down the side. He gets those reports. He has the tank caulked twice in a rather cursory manner. And one time he has the tank painted from a steel blue color to a brownish red color. It just happens to be the color of molasses. Lots of talk in the court case afterwards about how you could sort of still see it even though it was camouflage, but folks could still see the molasses coming down the side. So I think Gell kind of earns that reputation as a bit of a villain. 2 heroes in the book, I think. Lots of little heroes. I would call these heroes the 1A and the 1 hero. The 1A hero is a gentleman by the name of Isaac Gonzalez. He works for Gell. He works for U.S. Industrial Alcohol. He works on the tank site in the north end. Joe worked at the distilling plant for USIA in Cambridge, in Leachmere, where the molasses was taken to and distilled by rail cars. But Isaac Gonzalez works at the tank. He cleans up at the tank site. He helps the large molasses steamers that came up from Cuba and Puerto Rico and the West Indies with hundreds of thousands of gallons of molasses in their hold, hook up their hoses and helps with the offloading, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he has these premonitions that the tank is going to collapse. He sees the leaks. He hears the tank groaning after the deliveries. He gets reports from people that the tank buckles a little bit after deliveries. And he has premonitions that the tank is going to collapse. And so several times during the summer of 1918, so 6 months or so before the tank collapsed, several times he runs through the streets from his apartment in the south end of Boston to the north end, which is where the tank is located, runs onto the tank property, runs around the back, opens the valve, lets some molasses out into the inner harbor, closes the valve, and goes back home. And he testifies in court afterwards and says this was his little bit that he could do to help save a disaster or catastrophe, avoid a catastrophe. So he did this little act 5 or 6 times, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, running from the south end to the north end. He also testifies in court as to what a stress this put on his marriage, because his wife didn't believe him that he was leaving at 2:30 to go to the molasses tank. And so there's lots of testimony by Isaac about the stress this was causing him. And finally, by the way, he leaves USIA in September of 1918, joins the Army. So he is not there when the tank collapses. He does come back and testify. So Isaac, a very, very important character, I think, someone we should know. To me, the big hero of the book, and I think this is true, is Hugh W. Ogden, who's the judge that hears this case. Ogden's photo is down here if you get a chance later. It's the only gentleman that you see, 8.5 by or 8 by 10 headshot in his uniform. Ogden is asked by the court. Ogden is a very well-known and very well-respected Boston lawyer and businessman. He's asked by the Superior Court to hear this case. And he is told by the Superior Court that the case would probably take, 6 weeks of his time. It ends up taking 3 years of his time. There are 1,000 witnesses, 1,500 exhibits, 25,000 pages of court testimony that Ogden has to go through. But I found that Ogden really, throughout this trial, goes out of his way to be fair to the 119 plaintiffs who are in this case. Now, Ogden is a very wealthy man. He's a Boston Brahmin. He certainly would not socialize with these plaintiffs on a regular basis. These were mostly Italian immigrants and Irish city workers who worked at the North End paving yard. So there's no doubt that he would not spend a lot of time with them. But he does, I think, go out of his way to be fair during this trial. And what do I mean by that? Just an example. At one point in the trial, he asks the lawyers from both sides if they would be willing to meet on Saturday afternoons, have court be in session Saturday afternoons, because many of the laborers in this case worked at least 5.5-day weeks. And the only time they could testify was a Saturday afternoon. And so the lawyers say, no, we're not interested. The lawyers from both sides, even for the plaintiffs, say no. They don't want to come into town on the weekend. During the summer, they have summer homes they go to on the weekend. So they give Ogden a flat-out no. And so Ogden said, well, okay, in that case, we are going to keep court in session until 10 o'clock at night, several times. And he indeed does that. Many of the laborers who testified in this case do so in night court. So very important. And Ogden does that kind of stuff, I think, throughout. And really an interesting character, an interesting individual. Not only does he have this great legal background, he's got a very strong military background. He was a Judge Advocate General, a JAG, for the highly celebrated 42nd Rainbow Division that saw some very hard action in the First World War. He was in France. I think he brings that kind of military code of justice to the way he adjudicates his case. He's also a very strong religious personality in Boston. He is a major figure in the Episcopalian Church. In Boston, he's the son of a minister. I think all those things kind of come to bear on the way he hears his case, those three things. And so, to me, he's a very interesting character. He's a Boston figure that we should know about, and a very important character in dark times. So I tried to bring all of those elements together to put this whole story together. So what I thought I would do is just bring you up to date on the day itself, and then we can get to Q&As. And please, when we get to Q&As, feel free to ask anything you want. I love the question and answer session. So the day itself, let's talk about it. January 15th, 1919. It's about 40 degrees out. 2 days earlier, it had been 2 degrees. A little bit of January thaw, as we know it here. 2 days before, 700,000 gallons of molasses had been delivered, which filled the tank to the brim, 2.3 million gallons. The firefighters are playing cards. The children are out doing collecting their firewood. Some of the city workers are out at lunchtime. Some people are walking the streets. And a Boston police patrolman named Frank McManus is making his routine beat walk along Commercial Street. And it so happens, is making his routine call back to headquarters on the call box that's located on Commercial Street. When he hears what he describes later as a tremendous grinding, rumbling sound and the rat-tat-tat of what sounds like machine gun bullets. And he turns around and he sees this molasses tank disintegrating before his eyes, the rat-tat-tat of the rivets pulling free, thousands of them that become little missiles of themselves. And the tank begins to disgorge molasses. And he has the presence of mind, McManus does, to utter what I think might be one of the most remarkable utterances back to police headquarters even to this day. He says, "Send all available rescue personnel. There's a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street." So I don't think they've had a call like that since. That is the official call to Boston Police Department headquarters. And the wave came, and it came hard, about 35 miles an hour, about 35 feet high at the outset. It does level off to about 20 feet high and about 160 feet wide once it finally gets going. And it quite literally scours that north end Boston waterfront. The wave slams off the backside of Copp's Hill, for any of you who know that north end area, recoils off of Copp's Hill. The good news is it recoiled, the hill goes that way, the wave recoils off of it. If the hill went that way, we might have had hundreds of deaths in the north end. So that accident of terrain and topography really does help. But it quite literally destroys and scours that Boston waterfront, that Commercial Street waterfront. So think of it as a wave that picks up everything. People, animals, the horses get trapped. There are about 20 horses killed in the Great Boston Molasses Flood. Some of them by that initial wave. The others are shot that night by Boston police who put them out of their misery because they're so enmeshed in molasses. Pretty eerie scene in the book. Even though I wrote it, I thought it was kind of eerie as I was writing it. It's kind of weird. But yes, it's quiet at that point and the gunshots are reverberating around the harbor. But it quite literally turns into kindling. I hope you get a chance to look at the pictures if you haven't seen them in the book. These are bigger versions of what's in the book. But it quite literally turns that whole area into kindling. It severs the main support trestle of the overhead train as a train is going around. The conductor on the backs of the train sees the wave coming at him. The train clears, the wave hits the trestle along with about a 2-ton piece of steel tank, and it severs that trestle. That train jumps the track. The conductor has the presence of mind to get out of his little vestibule and climb over the twisted wreckage and stop another train coming from South Station in time. Otherwise, that train likely would have plunged to the street below. So it is madness. As I said, firefighters respond eventually to the scene. Sailors from the ships in the harbor are the first respondents to that scene, and you'll see some of them in these photos. Firefighters come and do lay their ladders out and pull victims. There were 11 victims found at the end of that first day. Several others were found in the ensuing days and weeks. Some aren't found for months. The last couple they are found in the harbor under the pier because they got knocked into the harbor. So quite a scene goes on. And then the scene at the Haymarket Relief Station afterwards is really something out of a movie, kind of surreal. Doctors and nurses, with their uniforms covered with molasses, gurneys covered with molasses. They didn't really even know whether the victims were men or women until they cut their clothing off because they were so covered with molasses. And it's funny, when we first hear about this, sometimes this story sort of produces a little giggle, molasses flood. But some real harrowing injuries and some awful ways to die for some of these folks with this molasses. And so that scene at the Haymarket Relief Station is an unbelievable scene. And then later, the massive cleanup that's underway, it begins really that evening and next day. Firefighters begin, they hook up to the hydrants, but it doesn't really do much good. That molasses does not wash away. Folks come out with, it doesn't totally harden, but folks come out with picks and chisels, that kind of thing, to try to move some of it. That doesn't do much good either. And finally, an enterprising firefighter has an idea of what might work to clean up the molasses. So I'll throw the question out to the crowd. If you haven't read the book, if you've read the book, please remain silent. If you haven't read the book, anybody have an idea on what that idea was to help with the cleanup? Anybody got a thought? No answer is a dumb answer. Yes? Burning. Burning is a great guess. Incorrect, as it were, but a good one. I think it's a pretty logical one, too. Anybody else got a thought?
Alcohol.
Alcohol, pretty good guess. Not quite right, but pretty good guess. One more.
Hot water?
Hot water is you're getting warm.
High pressure steam.
One firefighter has the idea that maybe briny salt water would begin to cut that molasses and wash it away. And indeed, that is what they do. They pump millions of gallons directly from Boston Harbor. Much of the molasses is washed into the harbor. The harbor is stained brown for months afterwards. I had one lady at a presentation I gave recently ask me, how long would the cleanup have taken had there been an EPA? I don't know. That's a good question. As it is, that begins that process. The hydraulic pumps are used in the buildings across the street from the tank, which are filled up to the first floor, cellars, and they use that to get those out of there. And really, it takes about 6 months to clean up that waterfront area, and that includes the rebuilding of the Boston Elevated from South Station to North Station, which I say to my wife, that's not bad. There's a bridge in Weymouth that's been under construction for 2 years. So I'm thinking that in 1919, 6 months of cleanup doesn't seem like a bad time, but that really is how long it takes. And it, of course, spawns this enormous court case that I mentioned to you earlier. And it's a great court case. These are huge figures in Boston's legal community that face off, that square off. Charles Choate, as I told you, wonderful lawyer for the defense. Damon Hall, who is not the Hall that is part of Choate Hall and Stewart. They don't become partners. It's a different Hall. Hall is a great lawyer, goes against Choate. And really, these two sides really put on a wonderful court case. Now, Choate's case is largely circumstantial, almost entirely circumstantial, about the anarchists being responsible for blowing up the tank. In fact, in his summary of the case afterwards, W. Ogden said it was a wonderfully presented case. The only thing Charles Choate was lacking was evidence, which is kind of an important thing. Even for those of us who aren't lawyers, we know that's kind of an important thing. And Damon Hall really comes at Choate hard on that issue, says that this is a ghostly anarchist, that there is no evidence whatsoever that an anarchist was there, that there's no evidence of an explosion of any kind of concussive force whatsoever. And so Hugh Ogden definitely agrees with Damon Hall, and I think does make the right decision in this case, that the tank should not have been there, that it was shoddily constructed, that it was overseen by someone who didn't know what they were doing, and that the tank eventually gave way and caused this disaster. One other quick thing, and then I'll get to questions. People say to me, what are the kind of long-lasting ramifications of this flood story? You know, it's a good story, there's some good drama, good characters, but what lives with us today? The first I already talked to you about, and that's that role of big business. I think that's with us today, and that relationship between government and business. The second, to me, is kind of a subset of that. After this flood, all of the things that we kind of take for granted today in the building construction industry, that building inspectors need to come out and look at work, that engineers need to sign and seal their plans, architects need to show their work, all of those things stem from the Great Boston Molasses Flood, first in Boston and then across the country. Keep in mind, this tank did not even require a building permit because it was considered a receptacle. No need for a building permit. But after this flood, those kinds of standards and requirements get put into place in Boston and then across the country. And so I make the analogy that the Great Boston Molasses Flood did for building construction standards what the Coconut Grove fire several years later did for fire standards. So you have these two Boston disasters that kind of have this influence across the country. So with that, thank you very much. I'm going to get a drink of water and then open it up for questions, if that's good with you guys. Okay? This is a previous testimony. There are very few I don't recalls. You know, there are very few sort of examples of buck passing. Almost every answer is really kind of candid and straightforward. Even when Gel is being questioned, Damon Hall goes at him pretty hard. And Damon Hall gets to that point about the 6 inches of water as opposed to the 50 feet. And he said, why didn't you fill this tank with water? And Gel said, because a decision was made that we had neither the time nor the money to do so. And so, of course, like any good lawyer would, Damon Hall asks the key question. By whom was the decision made? And Gel says, by me. And I'm thinking in 2009, that's not the answer. That's not the answer. So I was kind of fascinated by this wonderful primary source material, made my way through it. And the whole process took me probably about 4 years, you know, from beginning to end. I sent letters out to, this was my first book, thankfully. I have 3 out and a 4th coming out in the spring, but this was my first book. And I sent a note to, about a 5-page letter to 4 agents, New York City agents. 1 I didn't hear back from, 2 sent me back notes saying, we really like this, but it's not quite right for us. And then the 4th, I came home from a business trip in Sacramento one night, and my wife said, I think you better listen to this message. And it was from my current agent now, whose first name is Joy, she's a great joy to work with too. And she said she'd love to talk to me about representing me and all of that. Could you call me at home tomorrow? I called her at home that next day on Saturday. We kind of did the verbal handshake there. And then you start doing your proposal for the book. And nonfiction is almost always sold with a proposal, which includes character sketches, chapter by chapter outline, a marketing section, a sample chapter. So the proposal for Dark Tide was about 100 pages long. And that actually went to the publishing community, ironically enough, shortly after 9/11. Several publishers passed on it because people did not want to do a disaster book, quote, at that time. My agent thought, you know, when we were doing the proposal, my agent thought the book would sell in 2 weeks. And it didn't sell until December of 2001, not really a long time, but a lot going on, much bigger than me at that time. So we sold the book in December of 2000, and I wrote it, 2001. I wrote it in 2002, and it comes out in the late summer, fall of 2003. So it's kind of, that's a pretty long answer to your question. How long did it take me? Sorry about that. I got carried away with the story. So hopefully that's good. You're very welcome. What else we got? Yes, sir, way in the back.
What occupies the site currently?
Yeah, the site, what occupies the site currently? If you know the North End at all, it is currently the location just about of the bocce courts and the park, the North End Park on Commercial Street. As a matter of fact, people ask me if there's a sign that marks the site. There is. It's about 9 inches square, a green sign that the Bostonian Society put there in 1995, and it's set in the 3-foot stone wall on Commercial Street. So right there, if you know that area, yeah, it's good. Yes, sir.
Were there any resources left so the plaintiffs got paid the settlements?
Yes, good question. I'm glad you asked it. There was. Ogden does award damages. He awards about $6,000 to people who died immediately, to the family of people who died immediately. And I think if you multiply that by 100, you'd be about right, 600,000. These weren't big awards. Ogden says in his report that these were people of the working class. They weren't going to make a lot of money during their lifetime, which goes into these kinds of factoring. So he awards them $6,000. He awards $7,500 to people who suffered before they died, like George Leahy, who's under the firehouse for 4 hours. His family gets $7,500. Damon Hall is thrilled with the verdict, but not at all happy with the awards. He threatens to take USIA to court, to a jury trial, which is his right. They go behind closed doors, and they come out the next day and settle for about twice as much as what Ogden's original awards were. So Damon Hall does very well by his clients. The two biggest plaintiffs in the case are the City of Boston for the North End Paving Yard and Boston Elevated for the train. I may have these flipped, but I think it was $42,000 for the City of Boston and $25,000 awards to Boston Elevated. I may have those flipped, but those are the two biggest plaintiffs in the case.
What fraction did the lawyers get?
Good question. What fraction do the lawyers get? It seems to me there's not a lot of documentation on it. Of course, Charles Choate's paid by the company. It seems to me from talking to, I developed a relationship with Damon Hall's granddaughters when this book came out. There was some kind of contingency, and they don't know how much, and there's no documentation that I could find that sort of says that. So, is it still a third? I don't know at the time, but I would imagine it's in that ballpark. Yep. Yeah.
How is it that Arthur Joe kept his job after this strike?
Yeah. How is it that Arthur Joe kept his job? Actually, he didn't keep his job. He gets promoted. USIA, the distilling plant. The distilling plant, by the way, is located in the Leechmere section of Cambridge, right, kind of right past the Museum of Science, basically. It's about a mile from that Commercial Street site. That's where the distilling plant was. That plant closes in December of 1919, 11 months after the flood. And Gell is promoted to the corporate headquarters in New York City. He becomes a vice president. So. What can I tell you? Yes.
Was there any criminal action initiated against U.S. employees of the U.S.?
Good question. Was there any criminal action in this case? The answer is no. A grand jury does sit on this case, does not return any indictments. And I think that's probably, at least for what was known kind of at that time, that's probably the right decision. The only question I would have is the timing of when, if Gell knew about the steel plates, which apparently nobody inspected it, so he did not, I guess. So, but no criminal charges brought. This is strictly a civil suit. Yeah.
Did they transfer their operation someplace else, to some other unsuspecting?
Yeah. Did they transfer their operations? I'm glad you asked the question. USIA has distilling plants and tanks up the East Coast, down the East Coast. They're in Virginia Beach, they're in Baltimore, they're in Brooklyn, etc., and had pretty widespread operations. So it's not that they transferred them anyways, but they had them in these other locations. Very, very big company. Same kind of situation. In fact, one of the tanks in Baltimore, I think it was even bigger than the Boston tank. It held 3 million gallons of molasses.
And these didn't collapse.
They did not collapse. In fact, Charles Choate kind of makes that point during his open and during the court case that these other ones are still standing, so therefore somebody must have knocked down this Boston one. So, yeah. Yes.
I can't get over, even when I was reading it, that it was dripping and dripping, and the kids would bring it home for lunch or for whatever the mother did, cook with it, whatever. So much. And yet, to me, that is so crucial. To me, it is. And the other thing I wanted to just say while I have the floor, the first time I saw you was, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago when the book just came out.
Oh, thank you.
That's the first time I ever heard of the flood. And it amazes me that when I do talk to people over time, that had you not written the book, many of us never would have known about it. It's like a nice under-the-rug secret.
Yeah, I think that's right. Did you guys all hear her? Did you all hear? Yeah. I think that's right. It's one of those pieces of history I think that slip between the cracks. And yeah, people ask me why. I do deal with it at the beginning of the book, and I think it's kind of this combination of things that come together. One is the substance itself. Molasses does produce a little giggle when I tell people sometimes. And I think if it was water or fire, this thing would have been, Two, I think, most of these people are very ordinary folks. Boston justifiably views itself as a big picture history town, birthplace of the revolution, all of that. So I think these are ordinary folks. I think that comes as part of this. And I think the sources weren't there. I mean, I was kind of blessed to have this great archivist and doing a little bit of my own legwork to uncover these sources, and so I'm not quite sure there was enough there before that. So,
Last year, Method did your book. You
yes,
wrote the tops. I was away, but I did all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And different people, like you said, somebody's grandfather, somebody's this. So many people had stories about it, and yet it just never got out of the living room. I don't know how else to say it.
No, I think you're right. I had somebody recently ask me, do you think there'll ever be another book on the molasses flood? I said, I hope not. So yes, no, but thanks. Yeah, yes, sir.
If you lived on the North Shore, you never would have heard about it. But my parents were from Charlestown, and they were born in 1901 and 1903.
There you go.
So I grew up with stories. And when I was a little girl, my mother told me all kinds of stories.
Sure.
Because my mother and father used to walk over that bridge that went right from City Square that goes right to the Boston.
Sure.
And on a Sunday afternoon, they'd go to Bailey's for a hot fudge Sunday. So my mother told me about it all my life growing up.
Oh, sure.
I did know about it.
And it's funny because, there was lots of newspaper coverage on this. Boston had 7 newspapers at the
Yankee
time.
magazine did not.
Yeah, but I'm saying in the moment.
At the time, yeah.
So there were about 7, Boston had 7 newspapers. There was lots of coverage. New York Times covered it. And it knocked off the front page Prohibition and the Peace Treaty of Versailles. The Versailles Peace Treaty gets knocked off the front page for about a week, maybe 8-9 days. Tons of stories inside. I looked at all of them. Human interest stories inside. My favorite little anecdotal story was this small story that was headlined, Lynn Lawyer Not Killed in Molasses Flood. They kind of this report that this Lynn Lawyer had been killed, and on like day 4, this story appeared. But lots of coverage, and I think you're right. I think, in that greater Boston area, much more. Yeah, yes, sir.
When the tank basically exploded.
Yeah, didn't explode. Be very careful. Damon Hall would be mad at you if you said exploded. But yes, when it collapsed.
Started at the top and worked its way down, or was it the weight of the full tank?
Yeah, it's
From
basically.
the bottom to.
Yeah, how did it collapse?
Right.
It basically kind of collapses all at once, each way. So the roof of this tank kind of lands right under where it was, if you will, which is David Hall, and I was joking with you, but David Hall repeatedly objected to the use of the word exploded, which of course Charles Choate used all the time as part of this case. So yeah, interesting. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what do you think reports that people were smelling the smell of molasses years later?
Yeah, I think years later is right. You can't smell it now. I've been down there a lot. But I kind of like the folklore that's developed. Like some people say, can you still smell on a hot day? And I say, yeah, maybe you can. But you can't. But I think for years later, yes. And I will tell you sort of an anecdotal story. I had at one of my presentations, a gentleman come, and in his in the late 50s, early 60s. He was a meter reader for Boston Gas. And he said he would go into those basements on Commercial Street, and you could still smell them in the wood down there, which I tend to believe, that much molasses kind of gets in there. But I can tell you for a fact, on a hot day today, you cannot. But still worth going down there and kind of imagining that.
I'm firmly convinced that I smelled it once in the early 70s.
You may have. I mean, you have a great sense of smell. It's a great sense of smell coupled with like smell memory. So excellent. Yes, sir. Way in the back, in the exit, at the exit door.
Does any scarring exist on any existing structures in the North End?
Yeah. Does any scarring? Not really scarring, but if you go down to the site, across the street on the Cops Hill side, the same building is there. You can recognize it if you look at these photos. If you take your book down there, have you bought the book yet? No. If you take your book down there, look at the photo of the Cops Hill where all these onlookers are looking at one of the houses that got smashed in the flood, and you'll see the same exact building. They haven't changed much at all. But no real, you could not go down there and say, oh, I see the line or something like that. No. What else? Well, let me get somebody who hasn't asked. Yes. Yes.
Did you speak with anybody who had experienced the flood? How many people were still around?
Yeah. The answer to the question is no, and the reason is kind of quite deliberate. And believe me, I went back and forth on this a lot. My decision was, and I try to write history that I think gets rooted in sources as much as possible. My decision was that had I talked to somebody, they would have been in their 90s, which is not the showstopper, but the showstopper for me was they would have been a child at the time. And memories of children are largely unreliable. Now, you might have a memory, one memory that's seared into your brain where you say, oh, I remember vividly the way that thing came apart, or a snippet, but you just can't rely on it. So I kind of made a decision, if I could find sources, I would go with the sources. And much of the narrative of this is drawn from the court case. That's the opening scene, the prologue of Dark Tide, is Isaac running through the streets of the North End. That's drawn mostly from the, even though the book is structured, part 3 is the court case. A lot of the narrative is drawn from the court testimony. So, yeah. Yes.
I just, to go back to before this last question.
Yes.
Are you saying that they took the ocean water and washed, the whole, like these basements that the guys?
Not the basements. The basements they pumped out. But the molasses that was all over the streets and all over the place, much of that was washed away.
Yeah.
Hydraulic.
I just can't picture
Yeah,
it.
it took a long time to pump out. Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of that, I think that's part of the reason for that smell. Once that stuff gets in there, You drop that grandma's molasses on your kitchen floor and stuff, So just think about this, It's like pretty, yes, yeah.
Did you structure then the narrative at the beginning? How did you
Yeah,
did you have some structure for the narrative? You said let the narrative pull the big picture through, and I think that's great. When you read books, that's what the narrative keeps you going.
Yeah, yeah. Are you saying, was it deliberate? Oh, yes, it was deliberate. The narrative, is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, I just wanted, did you structure it right at the beginning?
I did, yes. Kind of made the decision that this is how I was going to go, and I did. I'm crushed that you think that happened by accident. I'm only kidding. No, yes, I did from the beginning. Did I see a hand wave? Yes, I see you. Yeah.
Before you wrote the book, did you like the taste of molasses?
Ah!
And afterwards, did you change?
And before I wrote the book, I'm not even sure I had many things with molasses in it. Since I've written the book, at many of these events we have molasses cookies. It's great. I mean, they're delicious. I'm not, my third book, which is the Boston Italians, we have like Italian food, so I love doing those. The molasses cookies are fine too. So yes, they're fine. I like molasses. It's fine. Yeah. Yes.
What's the topic of your new book?
The topic for my new book, it'll be out in. Can I say this to you? Yes.
One last question, and then
Sure.
I suggest that Steve will be around, and there's still some more books that can be obtained. And I'm sure he'll be around to answer a few questions. But one more, and then we'll break for
It'll be out in the spring of 2010. It is a Boston-related story. It takes place in the second half of the 19th century, from 1850 to 1900. So stay tuned. Can I say that? Yes, that's it. I will tell you that you will know soon if you are on my, you're probably not on my mailing list. If you would like to get on my mailing list, just send me an email at stephenpulio.com, which is the book.com, easy, and I will put you on my mailing list. I don't do, I do like 2 e-blasts a year. I don't inundate you with spam. You'll get 2 things from me at the most a year. And so you will know soon. It's nonfiction. No, it's nonfiction. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
After reading the book, your title is very appropriate.
Thank you. It was interesting. The title. I had a. The way this title was picked, people say, how'd you pick the title? I was with a group of friends, and I had about 6 or 8 different title possibilities. This was one of them. They all said immediately, "This is the one. We love Dark Tide." I spoke to an 8th grade class a little while ago, and one of the girls asked that, and she said, "Do you remember the other ones?" And I said, "I really don't." And I said, "I know I have that list somewhere." So I don't know. About 3 months later, I get a letter from her saying, and I said to her, "I'll see if I can find it." So like 3 months later, I get a letter from her saying, "Did you find those yet?" So, as it turned out, I did end up finding them, finding that slip of paper with the different titles on them. But no, I don't remember them now. But they were nowhere near as good. I can just tell you. Nowhere. Yes.
What is the relationship between molasses and rum?
Molasses and rum, I'd call the relationship intimate. Molasses was a huge business in the 19th century, particularly for the rum business. As a matter of fact, USIA even did some rum business, a small part of it. Mostly they were industrial alcohol. They did things like turpentine and solvents and that kind of stuff, but they did some of that as well. But no, it was a very important, molasses is the ingredient for rum. Distilleries all over Boston, New England, in the 19th century particularly. So, yeah. Yes?
You talked about your primary source material being the court case. Were you able to get any of the company's internal information?
Most of the company's internal stuff was included in the exhibits of the court case. So there are lots of, for example, communication between Gel and the steel company that delivered the plates and that kind of stuff. So the exhibits were great. Yeah, excellent. Yes?
So the idea that they were producing all this quickly, this molasses was used to make rum ahead of the prohibition.
Well, most of that molasses, as I say at the beginning, most of the molasses was used as the raw material for munitions and high explosives. After the end of the armistice is in November of 1918. So after that, for the most part, they are trying to get some molasses produced into rum to beat prohibition. What happened is prohibition is passed. Nebraska becomes the 36th state of the 48 at the time to ratify the Prohibition Amendment the day after the molasses flood, but there's a 1-year grace period. So January 17th of 1920 is when Prohibition goes into effect. It's passed January 17th of 1919, and there's a 1-year grace period. So that's kind of how that develops. So this day of the molasses flood, or the day after, the story about Nebraska ratifying is front and center too. It's on page 2, I think, of most of those papers. So.
I just had a question about Gonzalez. Do you know anything about what happened to him? Was he wrought with guilt?
Yeah, was he wrought with guilt? I will tell you that most of his testimony is wrought with guilt. Yeah, I mean, he almost, during his testimony, he always sort of says he wished he could have done more. I think that's the way that you would describe it, for sure. But he is really quite a character, I think. He's pretty courageous. He actually goes to Jel's office a couple times, and he's pretty much told, keep your mouth shut or you'll lose your job. But he's a pretty courageous guy, I think. Yeah, so. All right, you guys have been great. Thank you. Great questions.
This program has been a production of Topsfield Cable Television.